Welcome back to Trapped in History. I'm your host, Robbie Malcolmson, and this is episode 78. And today I want to talk to you about an activity that I've introduced to my students about 6 years ago that sounds incredibly simple, but is actually at the heart of studying history. And when we study history, we have to ask ourselves questions like, how do we know what we think we know? This activity is called One Man's Trash, and this is part one of part two. One Man's Trash on the surface is pretty straightforward. Students are given a collection of objects supposedly taken from someone's trash, and their job is to examine that evidence and determine what they can reasonably infer about the person who threw those things away. They might find a receipt, a magazine, food packaging, a medicine box, a pet collar, a lottery ticket, a soda can, or a household cleaning product. The students become detectives, but what they don't necessarily realize at first is that they're also becoming historians in a way. I begin this activity with a quotation from the British writer Peter Fleming. He once said, "Truth is a perishable commodity. Considerable care must be exercised when shipping it across the world." Before we do anything else, I ask students a simple question. What does that mean to you? I don't immediately explain it because I don't want my interpretation to become theirs. I want them to sit with it for a moment. I want them to wrestle with it. What does it mean for truth to be perishable? Can truth change? Or is Peter Fleming suggesting that truth itself doesn't change, but our ability to preserve and communicate it does? What happens to truth when it has to travel from one person to another, one culture to another, or perhaps, most importantly for our purposes, one century to another? I don't expect students to have sophisticated answers yet. In fact, that's part of the point. We return to the quotation later at the end of the activity after we've experienced how difficult reconstructing the truth from evidence actually is, especially only having 5 or 6 pieces of fake trash. The purpose of One Man's Trash is deceptively simple. Examine a limited amount of evidence and make the most reasonable predictions possible about the person who left that evidence behind. I give students several categories they might consider. What might the evidence suggest about the person's age, their socioeconomic situation, their location, their interest in their hobbies, their lifestyle, their technology use, whether they have pets or perhaps a family? There are numerous possibilities and options for them. But I give students an important warning before they begin. Do not overly infer. Predict information strictly from the evidence. That warning is really at the heart of the entire activity because students immediately discover how difficult it is to follow. And I start this by dividing the class into groups of 3, and I assign roles. There are detectives who examine the evidence, a scribe who records and the group's conclusions, and a leader who guides the conversation amongst the rest of the class. But I give that leader a particular sentence starter that I think may be one of the most important parts of the lesson. And that sentence starter is, the evidence suggests. Key word there, suggest. I don't want students saying, we know this person has a dog. I want them saying, the evidence suggests this person may have a dog. I don't want them saying, this person plays golf. I want them saying the evidence suggests this person has some connection to or interest in golf. Those may sound like minor differences in wording, but intellectually, they're enormous differences. One claims certainty and the other claims or recognizes at least the limitations of the evidence that's at hand. Then I turn them loose. Maybe one group discovers a copy of Golf Digest, an empty baby food jar, a crushed Coca-Cola can, a Claritin box for allergy medicine, a dog collar, and a Walmart receipt. Immediately, the room starts buzzing with people talking and sharing their ideas together. They might say things like, this person plays golf, or they have a baby, they own a dog, they have allergies, they shop in Walmart. And this is where my job becomes interesting, and where your job as the teacher could become very interesting. I'm going to put the link for this Google Doc or Google slide as well into the show notes. You can also email me at trappedinhistorypodcast@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to share this with you. So as a teacher, you start asking questions like, how do you know? What evidence supports that statement? Is there another possible explanation? How confident are you? Suddenly, statements that seemed obvious 30 seconds earlier become much more complicated. Take, for example, the Golf Magazine Digest. Does possessing Golf Digest prove that this person plays golf? No, it certainly suggests an interest in golf, but even that conclusion has limitations. Maybe someone else in the household bought it. Maybe it was given to the person. Maybe they enjoy watching golf, but have never played the sport. Maybe someone visiting the home left it behind. We don't know. And we can't forget the context here, that these items are found in a trash bag. The evidence permits certain reasonable inferences, but it doesn't give us permission to create an entire biography. The same thing happens with baby food jar. Students see baby food and immediately conclude that that person has a baby. But does the evidence actually establish that? Maybe they're a grandparent. Maybe they babysit. Maybe a friend with a child visited. Maybe the jar was used for something completely unrelated to feeding a baby. Once students begin thinking this way, the activity changes and becomes something deeper than what it seems like on the surface. That's when I tell them that what they're doing with the trash is essentially what historians do with the past. Think about how strange the profession of history actually is. We're asking someone living today to tell us what happened hundreds or thousands of years ago. Nobody alive today witnessed the Crusades. We can't interview a merchant traveling on the Silk Roads. We can't walk into a medieval village during the Black Death and ask the people what they believe is happening around them. We can't sit down with an ordinary French peasant in 1789 and ask how they feel about the monarchy. Those people are gone. What remains is evidence such as maybe letters, government records, paintings, coins, weapons, buildings, bones, pottery, clothing, diaries, laws, receipts, tools, monuments, ruins, and sometimes literal garbage. From those fragments, historians attempt to reconstruct human lives. This is why inference is so important to history as a skill. Historians constantly make inferences. They have to. The historical record is incomplete. Most people who have ever lived never wrote an autobiography. Many couldn't write at all. Countless documents have been destroyed, lost, censored, forgotten, or simply never created. The past doesn't arrive neatly organized into a textbook chapter. Historians encounter fragments and then they ask those fragments what they reasonably suggest. But there's a difference between an inference and a guess. A historical inference has to be anchored and cemented into evidence. It needs reasoning behind it. It should be open to revision if new evidence appears, and that's precisely what I'm trying to get my students to practice when they look at a dog collar and resist immediately, declaring that this person owns a dog. And then there's the skill of contextualization. We see this in AP and in other history classes. That's another world history teachers that they use constantly, especially in the higher level classes. Context is what gives evidence meaning. Imagine finding like an old bottle. By itself, it tells us very little. Now imagine learning that bottle was recovered from a 17th century shipwreck. Suddenly it becomes something different. Imagine finding a handwritten letter. Interesting, but now imagine discovering that the letter was written by a soldier the night before a major battle. The words in that letter, they take on another layer of meaning. Imagine discovering a political cartoon criticizing the government, and now imagine learning that that cartoon was secretly produced inside an authoritarian state where criticizing government could result in imprisonment or death. The object hasn't changed itself, but the context behind that object has. And because the context changed, our interpretation changed. And this is why I often say context matters so much. You know, that's one reason I tell students that history isn't always written in black and white. Sometimes the evidence is incomplete. Sometimes sources contradict each other. Sometimes people who left us evidence had motives of their own. Voices we desperately want to hear simply just are not present in the historical record. And that's when historians have to make careful inferences. But careful is the key word there. Evidence without context can mislead us, and context without evidence can become speculation. Historians need both. Another group might, in the actual activity that I do, one of the other bags that I have is interesting. We have topics like a Mountain Lightning kind of generic soda can from Walmart, a package of cutie oranges, a lottery ticket, a Walmart receipt again, and also a household bottle cleaner. And once again, the students, they start constructing more about this person. They may say something like, this person is trying to eat healthy because they purchased oranges, but they also drink soda. Or maybe they gamble because there's a lottery ticket there. And students start making those assumptions about income because there's a Walmart receipt, and suddenly something fascinating begins happening amongst those students. Students, if they're pushing themselves harder, they aren't merely interpreting the evidence anymore. They're interpreting the evidence through themselves and their own beliefs and experiences. And they use those to fill the gaps. Their assumptions enter the investigation, their stereotypes are appearing, their understanding of what certain products mean begins shaping the person that they are creating. And as they are wrestling with these ideas and they're trying to develop their skills more, it kind of reflects on the pursuit of historical truth and how it requires discipline. This is a beginning activity to kind of build some teamwork amongst the students and also get them used to inferring more at a higher level as these sources throughout the year get much more difficult. And we all together, we have to constantly distinguish between the evidence and what it demonstrates and what we are adding to the evidence ourselves. And that's why historians corroborate. One source can tell us something. Multiple independent sources pointing toward the same conclusion can increase our confidence. And the students are going to really start wrestling with this tomorrow. In my regular history classes, they're going to be tackling the Mongols and Genghis Khan through the lenses of the trade networks. And then my AP classes are going to be looking at how Renaissance changes man's view of man through about 10 different sources there. And it's all going to be about cooperation. So it's important here, again, that we're building these skills. So again, that multiple independent sources will point to some conclusion, and it can increase our confidence over time, or the student's confidence. One piece of evidence might suggest something that a person, and that's interesting, if I can find 5 independent pieces of evidence supporting the same conclusion, that makes your argument stronger. And that's why at the end of the activity, they'll write a paragraph about what does all 5 or 6 pieces of evidence say in a narrative way potentially about this person. And maybe that could be one of the biggest misconceptions that I want this activity to challenge in students. Students sometimes enter the history classrooms believing history is just simply a collection of facts and dates. Something happened, somebody wrote it down, historians put it in a textbook or a regular book. Sometimes students memorize it, and then we give them a test. And that's not really how history works. The past and history are not exactly the same. The past is everything that actually happened. History is our attempt to reconstruct and understand what happened using the evidence that survived. And that's why historians can study the same event and disagree about its meaning. One historian may emphasize economics, while the other one emphasizes religion or geography, politics, technology, social structure, or even intellectual change. They can examine the same past and construct a deeper meaning out of that past. And all that leads to different interpretations, but that doesn't mean every interpretation is equally valid or rational. Evidence still matters. Logic matters. Context matters. Corroboration and reasoning matters. A historical argument isn't simply an opinion. It's an interpretation constrained by evidence. And that's exactly what these students are beginning to practice when they're sitting around a collection of discarded objects trying to reconstruct a person that they've never met. At the end of the activity, which takes around a 40-minute class, I will ask them 3 questions. Why is context important? Why is inferencing important? And what are the dangers of inferring too much without enough evidence? By that point, those questions aren't abstract anymore. They've experienced them within their groups. They've seen classmates look at the same collection of objects and reach different conclusions than them. They've reached seemingly obvious conclusions, and then those fall apart after someone asks a good question, and maybe even caught themselves making an assumption that they couldn't actually support. So that's whenever we return back to the quote from Peter Fleming, "Truth is a perishable commodity. Considerable care must be exercised when shipping it across the world." Except now the quotation means something different to these students. They have now experienced how difficult it can be to transport truth even across a classroom table, much less across hundreds of years. And that's where we're going to stop part 1 for today in under a 20-minute episode, because there's another question hiding underneath this entire activity. It's much bigger than trash, and frankly, it's much bigger than history. If evidence is incomplete, if people can interpret the same evidence differently, and if our own assumption can influence what we believe we're seeing, then we eventually arrive at one of the oldest questions in philosophy. How do we know what we think we know? And that's where we're going to pick up in part 2. But as usual, before we conclude and I say my goodbyes, here's 3 questions for you as a student, as a teacher, as a history enthusiast to wrestle with. Number 1, how much evidence is enough before a historian can reasonably make a claim about the past? A side question to follow that up for support: at what point does a reasonable inference cross the line into assumption or speculation? Deciding that line can be quite difficult. Number 2, if the same piece of evidence can mean different things depending on its context, can evidence ever truly speak for itself? Or does evidence only gain meaning when someone interprets it? Number 3, imagine that historians 500 years from now discover only 5 objects from your life. What might they correctly infer about you, and what might they completely misunderstand? What does your answer reveal about the limitations historians face when reconstructing the lives of the people from the past? So as usual, listeners, keep questioning the past in order to understand the present, and be contagious.